The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Michael Bagent and Richard Lay. Chapter 4. Opposing the Consensus. Edmund Wilson, John Allegro, and Geza Vermes are all condemned. They all condemned the international team for secrecy, for procrastination and delay in releasing Qumran material, and for establishing a scholarly monopoly over the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wilson and Allegro both challenged the team's labored attempts to distance the Qumran community from so-called early Christianity. In other respects, however, all three scholars concurred with the consensus of interpretation established by the international team. They accepted, for example, the team's dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls as being pre-Christian. They also accepted the team's contention that the members of the Qumran community were Essenes. And they accepted that the supposed Essenes at Qumran were of a traditional kind described by Pliny, Philo, and Josephus. Aesthetic, reclusive, pacifist, divorced from the mainstream of social, political, and religious thought. If Christianity were indeed somehow connected with the Qumran community, it therefore emerged as less original than had hitherto been believed. It could be seen to have drawn on Qumran just as it was acknowledged to have drawn on conventional Old Testament Judaism. Apart from that, there was no particular reason to modify one's image or conception of it. By the 1960s, however, scholarly opposition to the international team's consensus had begun to rise from another quarter. Its questioning of that consensus was to be much more radical than anything submitted by Wilson, Allegro, or Vermes. It was to challenge not only the dating of the Qumran scrolls as established by the international team, but also the allegedly Essene character of the Qumran community. The men responsible for this criticism were Cecil Roth and Godfrey Driver. Cecil Roth was perhaps the most prominent Jewish historian of his era. After serving with the British Army during the First World War, he had obtained his doctorate from Merton College, Oxford, as an historian. For some years, he was reader in Jewish studies at Oxford, the post now occupied by Geza Vermes. He was a prolific writer and more than 600 publications to his credit. He was also editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He commanded enormous respect in the academic world and was recognized especially for his expertise in Judaic history. Godfrey Driver was a figure of comparable academic stature. He, too, had served with the British Army during the First World War, seeing action particularly in the Middle East. He, too, taught at Oxford at Magdalen College, becoming in 1938 professor of Semitic philology. Until 1960, he also did 3 stints as professor of Hebrew. He was joint director of the team which translated the Old Testament for the New English Bible. As we have noted, he was John Allegro's mentor and recommended Allegro for the international team. From the very first discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Driver had advocated caution about the early pre-Christian dates ascribed to them. In a letter to the Times on the 23rd of August, 1949, he warned that the pre-Christian date ascribed to the Qumran scrolls seems likely to win general acceptance before being subjected to critical examination. In the same letter, he stated, the external evidence for the pre-Christian date is extremely precarious, while all the internal evidence seems against it. Driver stressed the risks of attributing too much accuracy to what he called external evidence. To archaeology and paleography, he advocated. Let's try that again, that sentence. The external evidence for a pre-Christian date is extremely precarious, while all the internal evidence seems against it. Driver stressed the risks of attributing too much accuracy to what he called external evidence, to archaeology and paleography. No. Read, God. Again, let's read that sentence. Driver stressed the risk of attributing too much accuracy to what he called external evidence, to archaeology and paleography. He advocated, rather, a scrutiny of the internal evidence, the content of the scrolls themselves. On the basis of such evidence, he was eventually to conclude that the scrolls dated from the 1st century of the Christian era. In the meantime, Cecil Roth had been conducting his own research, and in 1958 published the results in a work entitled The Historical Background of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The historical background, he argued, was not pre-Christian, but on the contrary, dated from the time of the revolt in Judea between AD 66 and 74. Like Driver, Roth insisted that the text of the scrolls themselves were a more accurate guide than archaeology or paleography. Availing himself of this guide, he developed a number of points that not only ran counter to the international team's consensus, but must also have outraged the Catholics among them. Citing textual references in one of the scrolls, for instance, he demonstrated that the invaders regarded as adversaries by the Qumran community could only be Romans, and further could only be Romans of the empire, of imperial rather than republican times. He also demonstrated that the militant nationalism and messianic fervor in many of the scrolls had less in common with traditional images of the Essenes than with the zealots described by Josephus. He acknowledged that the original community at Qumran might indeed have been established by Essenes of the traditional kind, but if so, he contended, they would have vacated the site when it was destroyed in 37 BC. Those who occupied it subsequently after 4 BC and who deposited the scrolls would not have been Essenes at all, but zealots. Pursuing this argument a step further, he then endeavored to establish links between the Qumran community and the fierce defenders of Masada 30 miles to the south. Such assertions, needless to say, provoked indignant criticism from Father DeVoe's team. One of DeVoe's associates, John Carmignac, in reviewing Roth's book, complained that Roth does not miss any occasion to closely link Masada and Qumran, but this is another weakness of his thesis. Even when 8 years later Yigal Yadin, in his excavations at Masada, found scrolls identical to some of those discovered at Qumran, the international team refused to consider Roth's thesis. Quite clearly, some sort of connection had to exist between Qumran and Masada, yet the team, their logic now creaking painfully at the seams, insisted only one explanation was possible. Some of the Essenes from Qumran must have deserted their own community and gone to the defense of Masada, bringing their sacred texts with them. So far as Masada was concerned, Roth was then to be vindicated by Yadin's excavations, but he was also quite capable of fighting his own battles. In an article published in 1959, he focused particularly on DeVoe's assertion, based on supposed archaeological evidence, that the scrolls could not have been deposited any later than the summer of AD 68, when Qumran was taken by the 10th Legion. Roth demonstrated conclusively that the 10th Legion in the summer of AD 68 was nowhere near Qumran. Roth's arguments may have infuriated DeVoe's international team, but they were shared by his colleague Godfrey Driver. The two worked closely together, and in 1965, Driver published his massive and detailed opus on the Qumran material, the Judean Scrolls. According to Driver, arguments to the to pre-establish a According to Driver, arguments to establish a pre-Christian date of the scrolls are fundamentally unsound. The sole reasons for establishing such a date were, he pointed out, paleographical, and these cannot stand alone. Driver agreed with Roth that the scrolls referred to the period of the revolt in Judea, between AD 66 and 74, and were thus more or less contemporary with the New Testament. He also concurred with Roth that the Qumran community must have consisted of zealots, not traditional Essenes. He calculated that the scrolls could have been deposited at Qumran any time between then and the end of the second revolt in Judea, the rebellion of Simon Bar Kokhba between AD 132 and 135. He was scathing about the scholarship of the international team as exemplified especially by DeVoe. Roth and Driver were both famous, acknowledged heavyweights in their respective historical fields, who could not be ignored or cavalierly dismissed. Their prestige and their learning could not be impugned or discredited. Neither could they be isolated. And they were too skilled in academic controversy to put their own necks into a noose as Allegro had done. They were, however, vulnerable to the kind of patronizing condescension that the DeVoe and the international team, closing ranks in their consensus, proceeded to adopt. Roth and Driver, August though they might be... Wait a minute. Is that right? Excuse me? Roth and Driver, August though they might be, were portrayed as out of their element in the field of Qumran scholarship. Thus DeVoe, reviewing Driver's book in 1967, wrote, "It is a sad thing to find here once more this conflict of method and mentality between the textual critic and the archaeologist, the man at his desk and the man in the field. Not, of course, that DeVoe spent so much time in the field himself. As we have seen, he and most others of the international team were content to remain ensconced in their scrollery, leaving the bulk of the field work to the Bedouin. But the scrollery, it might be argued, was at least closer to Qumran than was Oxford. Moreover, DeVoe and his team could claim first-hand familiarity with the entire corpus of Qumran texts, which Roth and Driver denied access to. Those texts could not. And while Roth and Driver had questioned the international team's historical method, they had not actually confronted its excessive reliance on archaeology and paleography. Archaeology and paleography appeared to be the team's strengths, allowing DeVoe to conclude his review of the Judean scrolls by stating confidently and definitively that Driver's theory is impossible. He could also, by invoking archaeology and paleography, dazzle other figures in the field and effectively hijack their support. Thus, Professor Albright was persuaded to weigh in against Driver, whose thesis, Albright declared, was failed completely. Its failure, Albright went on, derived from an obvious skepticism with regard to the methodology of archaeologists, numismatists, and paleographers. Of course, he, Driver, had the bad luck to run into head-on collusion with one of the most brilliant scholars of the day, Roland DeVoe. Moving on to the offensive, the international team and the colleagues continued to bombard Roth and Driver with increasingly contemptuous criticism. Both, as Eisenman has observed, were ridiculed in a manner unbecoming their situation, and with such ferocity as to make one wonder. No one dared support them. No one dared risk the wrath of the now solidly entrenched consensus, and the scholarly sheep, as Eisenman says, fell into line. So far as Roth and Driver were concerned, their interest and reputations weren't confined exclusively to Qumran research. In consequence, they simply retired from the arena, not deeming it worthwhile to pursue the matter further. That this should have been allowed to happen testifies to the timidity and docility of other researchers in the field. It remains a black mark in the record of Qumran scholarship. If the international team had exercised a monopoly before, their position now appeared to be unassailable. They had outmaneuvered two of their most potentially formidable adversaries, and their triumph seemed to be complete. Roth and Driver had been driven to silence on the subject. Allegro had been discredited. Everyone else who might pose a threat had been intimidated into compliance. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the hegemony of the international team was virtually absolute. By the mid-1980s, such opposition as existed to the international team was scattered and disorganized. Most of it found expression in the United States through a single journal, Biblical Archaeology Review. In its issue for September-October of 1985, BAR reported a conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls held at New York University the previous May. It repeated the statement by Professor Morton Smith made at the conference. "I thought to speak on the scrolls of the Dead Sea documents, but these proved too numerous, too familiar, and too disgusting." It observed that the international team were governed, so far as it can be ascertained largely, by convention, tradition, collegiality, and inertia. And it concluded, "The insiders, the scholars with the text assignments, T.H. Gaster, Professor Emeritus of Barnard College, Columbia University, calls these insiders the charm circle, have the goodies to drip out bit by bit. This gives them status, scholarly power, and a wonderful ego trip. Why squander it? Obviously, the existence of this factor is controversial and disputed." BAR called attention to the residue of frustration and resentment built up among the scholars of proven ability who had not been admitted to the charm circle. It also, by implication, called attention to the benefits reaped by institutions such as Harvard University, where both Cross and Strugnell were stationed and where pet graduate students were granted access to the Qumran material. Let's read that again without the pause, shall we? It also, by implication, called attention to the benefits reaped by institutions such as Harvard University, where both Cross and Strugnell were stationed and where pet graduate students were granted access to Qumran material, while far more experienced and qualified researchers weren't. BAR ended its report by calling for immediate publication of photographs of the unpublished text, echoing Morton Smith, who asked his colleagues to request the Israeli government, which now has ultimate authority over those scroll materials, immediately to publish photographs of all unpublished texts so that they will then be available to all scholars. That Smith's exhortation was ignored again bears witness to academic faint-heartedness. At the same time, it must be mentioned that Smith's exhortation was unfortunate in that it implicitly passed the blame from the international team, the real culprits, to the Israeli government, which had more immediate problems on its hands. The Israelis had kept their side of the bargain made in 1967 that the international team would be allowed to retain their monopoly provided they published. The international team had not. Thus, while the Israeli government might have been irresponsible in letting the situation continue, it was not to blame for the situation itself. As Eisenman soon came to realize, most Israelis, scholars and journalists alike, as well as government figures, were appallingly ignorant about the true situation, and it must be said, indifferent to it. Through this ignorance and indifference, an outdated status quo had been allowed to continue intact. In 1985, however, the same year as the conference reported by BAR, a well-known Israeli MP, Yuval Ne'eman, began to take an interest in the matter and in the process showed himself to be surprisingly well briefed. Ne'eman was a world-famous physicist, professor of physics, and head of the physics department at Tel Aviv University until 1971, when he became president of the university. Prior to that, he had been a military planner, one of those responsible for evolving the basic strategic thinking of the Israeli army. Between 1961 and 63, he had been scientific director of the Sorque research establishment, the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. Ne'eman raised the issue of the scrolls in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament declaring it a scandal that the Israeli authorities had not reviewed or updated the situation, that the international team had been left with a mandate and monopoly dating from the former Jordanian regime. It was this challenge that finally forced the Israeli Department of Antiquities to investigate how and why an enclave of Catholic-oriented scholars should exercise so complete and exclusive a control over what was, in effect, an Israeli state treasure. The Department of Antiquities proceeded to confront the international team on the question of publication. What accounted for the procrastination and delays, and what kind of timetable for publication could reasonably be expected? The director of the team at the time was Father Beno, who on the 15th of September 1985 wrote to his colleagues. In this letter, a copy of which is in our possession, he reminded them of Morton Smith's call for immediate publication of the photographs. He also complained, as if he were the aggrieved party, about the use of the word scandal, not just by Morton Smith, but by Ne'eman. He also complained, as if he were the aggrieved party, about the use of the word scandal, not just by Morton Smith, but by Ne'eman as well, in the Knesset. He went on to state his intention of recommendation, John Strugnell as chief editor of future publications, and he requested a timetable for publication from each member of the team. Compliance with Father Beno's request was dilatory and patchy. Compliance with Father Beno's request was dilatory and patchy. The Department of Antiquities, prodded by Ne'eman, wrote to him again on 26th of December 1985, repeating its request for a report and for answers to the questions it had raised. One cannot be sure whether Beno based his reply on readable information received from his colleagues, or whether he was simply improvising in order to buy time, but he wrote to the Department of Antiquities promising definitely that everything in the international team's possession would be published within 7 years, that is, by 1993. This timetable was submitted in writing as a binding undertaking, but of course no one took it seriously, and in personal conversation with us, Ne'eman stated that he had heard on the grapevine that the timetable was already generally regarded as a joke. It was certainly proved to be so. There is no prospect whatever of all the Qumran material, or even a reasonable part of it, appearing by 1993. Not even the whole of the material from Cave 4 has been published. Following Allegro's Volume 4 discoveries in the Judean desert back in 1968, only 3 or more have been issued, in 1977, 1982, and 1990, bringing the total number of volumes to 8. Nonetheless, The intensifying pressure engendered panic among the international team. Predictably enough, a search began for a scapegoat who had brought the Israeli government into the affair, who had briefed Neaman and enabled him to raise the issue in the Knesset. Perhaps because of the repetition of the word scandal, the team concluded Vermes to have been responsible. In fact, Vermes had nothing whatever to do with the matter. It was Robert Eisenman who had briefed Neaman. Eisenman had learned from the omissions of Roth and Driver. He appreciated that the entire edifice of the international team's consensus rested on the supposedly accurate data of archaeology and paleography. Roth and Driver had correctly dismissed these data as irrelevant, but without confronting them. Eisenman resolved to challenge the international team on their own terrain by exposing the methodology and demonstrating that the resulting data were irrelevant. He opened his campaign with the book that first brought him to our attention, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, published by E.J. Brill in Holland in 1983. In this book, he posed the first serious challenge the international team had yet encountered to their archaeology and paleography. In his introduction, he explicitly flung down the gauntlet to the small group of specialists largely working together, who had developed a consensus. Giving the text limited audience and circulation, of course, the international team could simply ignore the challenge. Indeed, the likelihood is that none of them read it at the time, in all probability dismissing it as a piece of ephemera by an upstart novice. Eisenman, however, refused to let his efforts be consigned to oblivion. By 1985, his second book, James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher, had appeared in Italy, ironically under the imprint of one of the Vatican presses, Typographia Gregoriana. It carried an Italian preface, and the next year the same editions it carried an Italian preference. It carried an Italian preface, and the next year, with some additions and a revised appendix, was brought out by E.J. Brill. That same year, Eisenman was appointed Fellow in Residence at the prestigious Albright Institute in Jerusalem. Here he began working behind the scenes to acquaint the Israeli government with the situation and raise the scrolls on their agenda of priorities. The international team's stranglehold, he realized, could not be broken solely through decorous or even strident protest in learned journals. It would be necessary to bring external pressure to bear, preferably from above. Accordingly, Eisenman met and briefed Professor Neaman, and Neaman then forced the issue in the Knesset. Later that year, Eisenman himself approached Father Benot and verbally requested access to the scrolls. Predictably enough, Benot politely refused, adroitly suggesting that Eisenman should ask the Israeli authorities and implying that the decision was not his to make. At this point, Eisenman was still unaware of the stratagems employed by the international team to thwart all applicants who wanted access to the scrolls. He was not, however, prepared to be excluded so easily. All scholars during their tenure on the staff of the Albright Institute give one lecture to the general public. Eisenman's lecture was scheduled for February 1986, and he chose as his subject the Jerusalem community and Qumran, with the provocative subtitle Problems in Archaeology, Paleography, History, and Chronology. As in the case of his book on James, the title itself was calculated to strike a nerve. In accordance with custom, the Albright Institute sent innovations to all important scholars in the find in Jerusalem, and it was a matter of courtesy for sister institutions like the French École Biblique to be represented. 5 or 6 turned up, a higher number than usual. Since they were unfamiliar with Eisenman and his work, they may not have expected anything out of the ordinary. Gradually, however, their complacency began to crumble, and they listened to his arguments in silence. Footnote. For an outline of Eisenman's remarks, see Chapter 10, Science in the Service of Faith. End of footnote. They declined to ask any questions at the end of the lecture, leaving without extending the usual courtesy of congratulations. For the first time, it had become apparent to them that in Eisenman they faced a serious challenge. True to form, they ignored it, in the hope, presumably, that it would go away. The following spring, one of Eisenman's friends and colleagues, Professor Philip Davies of Sheffield University, arrives in Jerusalem for a short stay. He and Eisenman went to discuss with Megan Broshi, director of the Shrine of the Book, their desire to see the unpublished scroll fragments still sequestered by the international team. Broshi laughed at what apparently struck him as a vain hope. "You will not see these things in your lifetime," he said. In June, towards the end of his stay in Jerusalem, Eisenman was invited to tea at the house of a professor at the Hebrew University who would later become a member of the Israeli Scroll Oversight Committee. Again, he took Davies with him. A number of other academics, including Joseph Baumgarten of Baltimore Hebrew College, were present, and early in the evening John Strugnell, Allegro's old adversary and subsequently the head of the international team, made his appearance. Boisterous and apparently intent on confrontation, he began to complain about unqualified people importunately demanding access to the Qumran material. Eisenman responded on cue. How did Strugnell define qualified? Was he himself qualified? Aside from his supposed skills in analyzing handwriting, did he know anything about history? Ostensibly, it was all a half-joking, more or less civilized debate, but it was growing ominously personal. The next year, 1986 to 87, Eisenman spent at Oxford as senior scholar at the Oxford Centre for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies and visiting member of Linacre College. Through contacts in Jerusalem, he had been given 2 secret documents. One was a copy of the scroll in which Strugnell was working, part of his private fiefdom. This text, written apparently by a leader of the ancient Qumran community and outlining a number of the community's governing precepts, is known by those in the field as the MMT document. Strugnell had shown it around at the 1985 conference, but had not published it, nor has he yet, though the entire text comes to a mere 121 lines. The second document was of more contemporary significance. It comprised a computer printout or list of all Qumran texts in the hands of the international team. What made it particularly important was that the international team had repeatedly denied that any such printout or list existed. Here was definitive proof that vast quantities of material had not yet been published and were being suppressed. Eisenman had no hesitation about what to do. Since I had to decide that one of the main problems between scholars which had created this whole situation in the first place was overprotectiveness and jealousy, guarded secrecy, I decided to circulate anything that came into my hands without conditions. This was the service I could render, plus it would undermine the international cartel or monopoly of such documents. Eisenman accordingly made available a copy of the MMT document to anyone who expressed a desire to see it. These copies apparently circulated like wildfire, so much so that A year and a half later, he received one back again from a third party who had asked if he had seen it. He could tell by certain notations that this was one of the copies that he had originally allowed to circulate. The print out, like the MMT document, was duly circulated, producing precisely the effect Eisenman had anticipated. He made a particular point of sending a copy of it to Herschel Shanks of BAR, thus providing the journal with ammunition to renew its campaign. By this time, needless to say, Eisenman's relations with the international team were deteriorating. On the surface, of course, each maintained with the other a respectable academic demeanor of frosty civility. They could not, after all, publicly attack him for his actions, which had been manifestly disinterested, manifestly in the name of scholarship. But the rift was widening between them, and it wasn't long before a calculated attempt was made to freeze him out. In January 1989, Eisenman visited Emir Drori, the newly appointed director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. Drori inadvertently reported to Eisenman that he was about to sign an agreement with the team's new chief editor, John Strugnell. According to this agreement, the team's monopoly would be retained. The previous deadline for publication, expected by Father Bonneau, Strugnell's predecessor, was to be abrogated. All remaining Qumran material was to be published not by 1993, but by 1996. Eisenman was naturally appalled. Attempts to dissuade Drori, however, proved futile. Eisenman left the meeting determined to employ a new and more drastic stratagem. The only means of bringing pressure to bear on both the international team and on the Department of Antiquities, and perhaps stop Drori from proceeding with the contract, would be Israel's High Court of Justice, which dealt with miscarriages of justice and private appeals from individuals. Eisenman explored the question with lawyers. Yes, they concluded, the High Court might be persuaded to intervene. In order for it to do so, however, Eisenman would have to present it with proof of a miscarriage of justice. He would have to show, preferably in writing, that access to the scrolls by a legitimate scholar had been refused. At the time, no such record existed, not at least in the legalistic sense the court would require. Other scholars had, of course, been refused access to the scrolls, but some of them were dead. Others were scattered across the world, and there was none of the required documentation. Strugnell would therefore have to be approached with a series of new requests for access to specific materials, which, as a foregone conclusion, he would refuse. Now that Eisenman had the catalog numbers, his task would be easier. Not wishing to make this request alone, Eisenman felt it would be more impressive if he enlisted the support of others. He approached Philip Davies of Sheffield, who agreed to support him in what both recognized would be only the first shot of a prolonged engagement fought through Israeli High Court. On the 16th of March, 1989, the two professors submitted a formal letter to John Strugnell. They requested access to certain original fragments and photographs of fragments found at the Qumran site designated Cave 4, and listed in the computer printout which Eisenman had leaked into circulation. In order to preclude any misunderstanding, they cited the reference number assigned by the printout to the photographic negatives. They also requested access to a number of scroll commentaries, or commentary fragments, related to the primary text. They offered to pay all costs involved and promised not to publish any definitive transcription of translation of the material, which would be used only in their own research. They promised to abide by all the normal procedures of copyright law. In their letter, Eisenman and Davies acknowledged the time and energy expended over the years by the international team, but they said they felt the team had already been adequately compensated by enjoying such long and exclusive access to the Qumran material. They stated that 35 to 40 years was long enough for other scholars to have waited for similar access, without which we can no longer make meaningful progress in our endeavors. The letter continued. Surely your original commission was to publish these materials as quickly as possible for the benefit of the scholarly community as a whole, not to control them. It would have been difficult, perhaps, if you and your scholars had discovered these materials in the first place. But you did not. They were simply assigned to you. The situation as it now stands is abnormal in the extreme. Therefore, as mature scholars at the height of our powers and abilities, we feel it is an imposition upon us and a hardship to ask us to wait any longer for the research availability of and access to these materials 40 years after their discovery. Eisenman and Davies expected Strugnell to refuse their request. Strugnell, however, did not bother to reply at all. On the 2nd of May, therefore, Eisenman wrote to Amir Drury, who earlier that year had renewed the international team's monopoly with the publication deadline of 1996. Eisenman enclosed a copy of the letter to Strugnell, mentioning that it had been posted to both of Strugnell's address at Harvard and in Jerusalem. Of Strugnell's failure to reply, he wrote, "Frankly, we were tired of being treated contemptuously. This kind of cavalier treatment is not really a new phenomenon, but is part and parcel of the process that had been going on for 20 to 30 years or more. Since Strugnell would not grant access to the Qumran material, Eisenman requested that Drury, exercising a higher authority, should do so. He then made two particularly important points. As long as the international team continued to control the Qumran text, it would not be sufficient merely to speed up the publication schedule. Nothing short of free scholarly access would be satisfactory. To check the international team's conclusions, to allow for variations in translation and interpretation, to discern connections the team themselves might perhaps have overlooked. We cannot be sure that they have exhausted all possible fragments in relation to a given document, or that they are putting fragments together in proper sequence. Nor can we be sure if the inventories are in fact complete and that the fragments may not have been lost, destroyed, or overlooked in the same manner or for some reason. Only the whole of the interested scholarly community working together can assure this.